My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs, and really honored to be working with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders on opportunities like this to engage with people across Canada, and who knows, now that we're doing this so virtually, maybe people around the world. Just two quick logistical things, and I'm going to pass it over to Durhan to introduce the topic. The questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel, that is for your opportunity to really engage the panelists, ask some questions. I'll do my best to moderate those, but don't wait until the end to actually get them going. Whatever comments or thoughts or questions you have, bring them forward right away. So with that, I'm going to throw it right over to Durhan to introduce the series and the panel. Durhan.
Thank you very much. I'm Durhan Wong-Rieger. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. And this is the second of this spring series on the PMPRB, which I somewhat ironically said we are not really thrilled to have to present, but given the fact that the PMPRB has not announced their intentions to delay the implementation of the regulatory changes, nor have they given us any indication as to when the announced draft new guidelines will be coming out, we seem to have no recourse but to continue to engage public and certainly our community in terms of the proposed changes and what the implications might be. Those of you who were with us last week had the opportunity to hear from the patient advocates and what it means for them to be able to have access to new medications and certainly to have access to clinical trials, and what any potential delay in terms of those therapies coming to Canada would mean to their lives as well as their quality of life. This week, we're actually going to focus on what is it that it takes for an industry to make the decision of what to launch, when to launch, where to launch. And we're really thrilled to be able to have with us an outstanding set of panelists who are going to give you various perspectives on the importance of being able to bring drugs and clinical trials to an environment as quickly as possible. The Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders is Canada's national rare disease network, and we are so really thrilled in terms of the kind of participation that we've seen from our members in this entire time. Next slide, Bill. So here's our panel for today. Andrea Suchin, who is the Senior Director of Business Operations Canada, Marketing North America at Sobi. We're really thrilled to have her here. She's spoken at a number of our conferences. Dr. Craig Campbell, who's the Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Epidemiology at Western University in London. He's also spoken at a number of our conferences, and many of you will know him as one of our outstanding researchers and clinicians in pediatric rare diseases. Fred Horn, who again is no stranger to us and a huge advocate for us. He's past Alberta Health Minister. He's a principal in Horn Associates, senior advisor with the 360 Public Affairs, and really, really important as a friend of the rare disease community. We'll have an opportunity to do Q&As as well. Next slide, Bill. Just to get us started, just the quickest recap for all of us to be on the same page as we're entering into this series. Most of you, I'm sure, will know is that what we're talking about are regulatory changes passed in August to the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board. Those changes have two major sets of regulations around them. The first is the change to the comparator countries against which we set the maximum list price for drugs. Some of you will have been involved with this in the past, know that we have changed the basket from 7 comparator countries, dropped the top 2, added 5 lower price countries so that we have a new set of 11 countries, which will in fact drive the maximum list price for drugs much further down in terms of the OECD median. And there's also been then a new regulation introduced, which will provide some economic factors. Not going to go into any detail in terms of how those work at the moment. What we will say is that they are indeed arbitrary. They're really a uniquely Canadian manufacturer's rebate pricing cap, and also arbitrary in terms of the price that they've set in terms of the quality adjusted life year. Again, we're not going to go into details of that. There's more information on the website and certainly elsewhere. What we do know, next slide, Bill, is that it will change us from being where you can see us now as being somewhere third in line in terms of price, the maximum list price of drugs, farther down towards the OECD maximum, if we can, median for the maximum list price, if we implement just the 11 basket of countries. And again, not in big detail to tell you that. What we are most concerned about, though, is in fact that if we include the economic factors, include the caps that the PMPRB has set as in fact binding, it will drive our maximum price that can be paid, not the list price, the maximum actually rebated price that can be paid somewhere close to where Slovenia is. And this is what is chilling for us. And hopefully we will have Andrea talk to us a bit about why this is a huge concern in terms of how companies make the decision of where they're going to place their new drugs, when they're going to place them, and also where they're going to put their clinical trials. Canada has been in that top tier for a long time. And it's kind of, the case. We pay reasonably good prices for drugs. We get early access. We get clinical trials. Next slide, Bill. And we just wanted to show you what the research is showing now. Even since the regulatory changes were announced 2.5 years ago, we've seen the number of new drugs coming to Canada has dropped precipitously. The rate fell to just 15% of the drugs that were in the US, whereas we were before that about half. We always lagged a bit, but we've never seen it this bad. Next slide, Bill. And for those of us who are waiting for new therapies, those who are relying on clinical trials to get access, what we've seen then is a 50% drop in terms of clinical trials. And quite frankly, there may be some other factors that may be accounting for it. Certainly, we know that in speaking to some of the companies, the concerns about where our pricing is going to be really has influenced whether or not they're going to be bringing those drugs in quickly. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass it over to Andrea, who's going to give you her perspective in terms of how companies make decisions about when and where they are actually introducing drugs. Andrea.
Great. All right, next slide, Bill. And thank you, Durhan. So the question is it's a good and a fair question. And the question that Durhan asked me to answer today is, how do international pharmaceutical companies make decisions about what therapies to bring to what countries and when? Next slide. So it's not a straightforward or I guess it's somewhat of a complex answer. So bringing a drug to market is not necessarily a straightforward process. So there's a lot that goes into it. First off, the research and development of a drug is a long and costly process. And I think this has come up at many CORD conferences, just how much time and energy and effort and dollars go into the development of a drug. So once that drug starts to look promising and a company starts to think about bringing that drug to market, they're going to start thinking about how to recoup the investment they've already put into developing that drug, and then also look at generating what is a positive ROI. So lots of investment, shareholders, investors, funders are putting money into it. And of course, in a lot of cases, they've had money in it for a long time, and they're looking at how do we actually start to generate a return for that investment. So when a company is starting to look at that, they of course have to make some pretty tough decisions. They want to be able to ensure access to the medicines for as many people in the world as they can, but they do have limited resources. So we do have to look at where to invest these limited resources, how and when and in what order. So a lot of these decisions are not actually made at the local affiliate level. So they're usually and typically made at the global or headquarter level. And these decisions would include, how and when we're launching those products, what's the price of that product. It's very rare that those decisions would be made at the affiliate level or, in our case, in Canada. So my role and the role of an affiliate in Canada is to act as an ambassador for Canadians and Canadian patients. It's up to us to demonstrate to our global team and headquarters that Canada is a viable market with a potential for a positive ROI. And again, we're one of many countries vying for those limited company resources. So we have to build the case. We have to submit a business case that explains how and why drugs should be launched here. And in doing that, it's also critical that we properly manage expectations. So we have to provide some degree of predictability and certainty that we'll be able to actually generate the return on investment in our country, and actually, even generate or recover the cost of bringing the drug to Canada. So next slide, Bill. So what does that actually look like? So as the company starts to prepare for launch, something that as an affiliate, we'll hear about a new drug or something that's coming to market, we know it's coming. And one of the first steps that we have to take is to complete the business case. So each affiliate around the world would be asked to put together a case on how we actually, or what that drug launch could look like in Canada. And what they're looking at is the ROI. And we're developing that based on looking at the market opportunity, of course, multiplied by the price, and then subtracting out the cost of actually bringing the drug to that market. And there are quite a few factors that go into each of these elements. And we're looking at this not just as a point in time, but as over time. So go next, click the slide. So over time, they're looking at, it's not just what's the return on investment in year one, but they're looking year 1, year 2, year 3, and so forth, to try to determine when we're actually going to cross into a point of a positive ROI. So in building out that case, and this is a somewhat simplified version of the cases that we're actually building, but I wanted to give you an idea of the criteria that goes into these elements and these decisions. So this is by no means an exclusive list. But for example, if we're looking at the market opportunity, they're going to look at things such as the size of the market. So in Canada, what's the number of patients, or what's the number of syringes we expect, or doses, or pills? So you're looking at the overall size of the market. And another key consideration there are what are the other treatments available in that country? Are there competitors? Are there typical treatment regimens? Where does this drug fit within that? And how can we actually find a place in that market? We'll take that and then we'll multiply it out by the price. So looking at the price, they're going to be looking at a number of different things. I mean, we have to take into account a couple different prices. First off, there's the list price. So what is the visible price? So in our case, that would be the PMPRB price. What's the negotiated price? So as we know, there are discounted prices that are determined through PCPA or through negotiations with other payers. So that actually ends up being the selling price of that drug in that market. So that also needs to be taken into account. We look at reference markets. So something Durhan just mentioned is the PMPRB 7 or 11. Canada, in our case, we look at 7 or 11 other countries to determine what and those are the references for the price here in Canada. Similarly, there are other markets or other countries that look at Canada as a reference. So Brazil, for example, which is a big country, they look to Canada to see what the price in Canada is. So that's all taken into account. The cost. I mean, there are tons of costs associated with bringing a drug to market, but the key ones here are submissions. So what does it cost to develop the submission, and what are the fees associated with Health Canada, with CADIT, with NEST, with any of the other payers? What are the local resources that are required? Do we have a local affiliate? How do we use the headcount that we have? Do we need to add headcount? Do we need to add more people to bring this drug to the market? We'll also look at what the product portfolio is. So what are the current products and what are the future products that this company has or the affiliate has in Canada? And they'll look at, is there a positive impact or is there a negative impact to those drugs? So they have to look at the overall basket and the overall picture of that affiliate in that country as well. And in looking at this, I mean, if you come back to the overall ROI, again, it's over time. So click, Bill. You're looking at when do we actually generate a positive return on our investment? When you're trying to build that up, you're looking at, of course, your time to reimbursement. In Canada, we know that's relatively long. And then again, what's the product portfolio and what's sort of the vision of that affiliate over time? So when we're doing that, again, we're putting forth these cases, and we have to be very clear to outline any assumptions that we've made in order to manage all the expectations. It's important for us to be able to manage expectations of global, and then global will manage the expectations of shareholders or investors. So it's important that everything in there is relatively accurate and has some degree of certainty. So we build these full business cases, and then each affiliate sends them into global. We present that business case, and it's actually up to global to prioritize and group each of these countries into what we call launch waves. So those countries that would have a bigger impact would probably end up in wave 1 or wave 2, and those with a lower impact might end up in wave 3 or wave 4, or they might take the decision not to launch in that country. And that, of course, is to appropriately manage all of those limited company resources. Next slide. So it's a pretty comprehensive process. And what does that actually mean for us in Canada, and what does that look like? Next. In Canada, we actually represent only about 2% of the global pharmaceutical revenue. So we're relatively small. It's a small market opportunity. Largely that's driven by a small population, but there are, of course, a number of other factors in there as well. Next. And as many of us on the call know, we also have a very long and complex review system for medicine. So many different steps, many different bodies, many different decisions. It's already a long time before we actually get reimbursement on the public and private plans. So click though. So even in Canada already, it takes anywhere between sort of 9 or 12 to 24 plus months to access medicines. That's a relatively long time. I've gotten some very sort of confused looks on the faces of some of my global counterparts when I've shared that information. At each of these steps, there's also the opportunity for a decision that's made that could, blindside you or could sidetrack your plan. So there are a lot of, as you can see with the boxes on there, there's a lot of opportunity to sort of throw the predictability or the certainty of your assumptions. That predictability is challenging. Also, with each of these steps, there's costly fees and resources. It takes a lot of people and money to bring the drug through every single one of these steps that you see on the slide. So already we're in sort of a challenging position. PMPRB has always been part of that process, but now with the additions that they're making, there are added levels of complexity and added layers. Next. So I don't want to take too much time going through the details of the PMPRB changes, but I did just want to highlight that in there, it's an uncertain multi-step process that's not used by any other country. Of course, there are elements that are similar to what they do in other countries, but there are other elements that are new, complex, and highly unpredictable. On sort of the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a number of different steps. There's a maximum list price, maximum rebated price, further adjustments, reassessments. So there's a lot that's going to happen, and at this point, it's hard to say what that'll actually look like. What we do know and we can estimate when we have taken some drugs through the process, sort of theoretically, what we are seeing, next slide though, is that there are some pretty major impacts to the Canadian system. So these impacts of the pricing reform, first off, steep price reductions. That should somewhat of a given, that is what PMPRB was trying to do, but the impact of those steep price reductions is a lot greater than I think was initially anticipated. There's one data set that shows that there are expected price reductions of about an average of 83% for rare disease treatments. Now, can you imagine if I'm talking to my global counterparts and trying to convince them to bring the drug to Canada and they say, okay, Andrea, the price will be $100 in Canada. And I come back to them a couple of weeks later and say, well, I can get you $17. That's going to be pretty quick. I think that conversation will end pretty quickly. They'll look somewhere else where they can maybe get a little bit more money than $17. Again, there are varying levels of uncertainty. So with that new process, all the different steps, it makes it difficult to estimate where and how the price will land. Variable pricing over time due to the economic factors, adjustments, reassessments, more adjustments. So it'll be very hard for us to predict how and what price a drug will be, when and for how long. So that'll be difficult for us as well. The global impact, as I mentioned, many countries will reference Canada, and so that will also be taken into account. Is what's the impact what are the downstream effects of having that price publicly available in Canada? Next. So coming back to our Canadian business case, I mean, as you can see across the board, there's significant amount of downward pressure caused by these new PMPRB pricing reforms, and overall, I think that will cause a downward effect on our ROI. And what that will result in is a drop from where historically and currently we're sitting in sort of wave 1 or 2. There's a very good chance and a very high likelihood we'll be moving down to wave 3 or 4 with these changes. So what that means is longer delays to getting drug decisions on whether we will be getting those drugs in Canada or not, a higher likelihood that we will not. So it's a pretty unfortunate and it's a pretty unfortunate reality. And we've even seen that, next slide. We've even seen that in the results of some surveys. So there was a survey recently conducted by LSO, Life Sciences Ontario, where they interviewed a number of pharmaceutical executives here in Canada, as well as at the headquarter and global level. And 97% of them said that they expect a negative impact to product launches, commercialization, and supply of products to the Canadian market. So this is a very, very real outcome of the changes of the pricing reform. So next slide. So I think we're in a position where, as I mentioned, there's a negative impact or potential for a negative impact, and I think we really need to think about it as a collective unit. Everyone that's involved in industry. I think as Canadians, we all want the same outcome, and that's that we all want to ensure timely access to medicine for Canadian rare disease patients, all Canadian patients. So this is something we really have to think about. It's important that we work together in an understanding manner to achieve this. We really need to rethink the current plans that are in action right now.
So thank you very much, Andrea. So what I'd like to do is actually go to one of the videos that we actually had. Some of you will have been with us in Ottawa for our conference, and we took the opportunity to give patients the opportunity actually to express what their concerns were with regard to having access to therapies or to clinical trials in a timely fashion. Are you doing Laura, Bill?
Hi, I'm Laura Thierrett. I'm here with the Canadian FOP Network. My son is 11. He has FOP. It is a very rare progressive disorder. With age and with trauma, the soft connective tissues are turning to bone, restricting mobility, basically imprisoning them in a second skeleton. The reason I'm here, I want to ask, is there are a lot of drugs in trial or about to go into trial for our condition, and we are hopeful that there is a treatment to save my son's mobility, and we are very concerned that we are not going to have access or be able to afford these drugs here in Canada. My son and the other 17 individuals affected with FOP in Canada deserve to have full access to mobility in their lifetime, and the federal government can't put a price restriction on that.
So thank you very much. Craig, I'm going to turn to you. I'm sure you've had that scenario played out for you as well as a clinician and a researcher working with the children with rare neuromuscular disorders. What does it mean to you in order to be able to have early access to clinical trials and new therapies, as well as having that research support? And how do you think Canada compares to other countries when you talk about colleagues around the world?
Yeah, thanks, Durhan. I mean, in fact, this scenario, that very moving video that you just played, actually plays out almost every day in in clinic, and in fact was really one of my motivations when I started out my career and went in sort of clinic room after clinic room, interacting with families on this often difficult journey with rare disease, saying I see a clinical trial in some other country, I see an opportunity somewhere else, why isn't it here? And that's I think been a important motivator for myself, particularly in the neuromuscular field, to make sure that we mobilized ourselves as a neuromuscular community to try and provide these opportunities for patients and families. And so at its very base, of course, it is an opportunity to access drugs that may be beneficial, not only for the individual person, but I think many out there have a more broad view of rare disease and want to contribute to patients throughout Canada and even internationally. And so that's the kind of paradigm that families are going into this, that they can help not just themselves but others. That's really important, and that's those are their preferences about their healthcare, and we have to be there as clinicians and the wider community to make that happen. It provides hope and progress for patients, the clinicians, and the community. But there's also a side to this that is maybe a more practical side of things, in that it also is the basis for having for doing clinical trials and clinical research, that you learn a lot of lessons. Sometimes they're hard lessons, and we all know there's clinical trials that fail to show a benefit, and those are sometimes the most devastating, results for families. But out of that too, there are lots of lessons we learn about how to do, clinical trials better and contribute more broadly to the long arc of things getting better. So learning about outcome measures for families, learning about which are the most responsive parts of the disease trajectory that's going to respond to treatment, and other gaps in the system. We've seen a few numbers that you presented about how Canada's doing compared to other countries. And that's a difficult, I find it particularly difficult in Canada to really understand how we're doing in the rare disease space, partly because we don't really have a comprehensive rare disease strategy that helps us track all these. And that in and of itself would be helpful if we could compare, really very decent solid numbers about how we're doing compared to other countries with rare disease strategies, but we don't have that. But what I can say, and Andrea spoke to this a little bit, is the process is very complicated already. It's very hard already, and if we need to find ways to smooth out that pathway rather than potentially put other obstacles in place for pharma companies who are trying to do that. And as all of us know, and I've said this before, unfortunately, it seems so often that we all come out the end of an attempt to get a rare disease through clinical trial, through regulatory approval, through commercialization, and we often all come out the end, everyone in the community, feeling that things were substandard. And so there's lots of spots where we can improve, but if there's new obstacles coming up in Canada, that won't be good with our, already some of the challenges we face. So, I think that we need to, in Canada, because we are a small market and a small population, we really need to together, but the call out here is to clinicians to really work with the whole community all the way through the process, from clinical trials through to commercialization. I feel we have the ability to have valuable input all the way along that pathway.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. And, we turn to you a lot because you're one of our outstanding clinician researchers, but also an outstanding advocate for the patients. And we feel bad a lot of times because we know how much work you have to do in terms of doing advocacy in addition to just treating the patients. And I'll come back to you again because I've got a couple of other questions. But maybe what we'll do is, Bill, if you don't mind just playing another video there, and we'll, kind of bring Fred back in as well to respond to it.
Hi, my name's Kathy Ivanachko, and I'm a patient advocate for families living with tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC. TSC is a rare genetic disease that causes tumors, seizures, and intellectual disabilities. My daughter was diagnosed when she was an infant with TSC when she started having seizures. There has never been a treatment for tuberous sclerosis until a few years ago when clinical trials started in the US. So we were lucky enough to get my daughter included in a clinical trial in Cincinnati. So every 3 months from Calgary to Cincinnati, we took her to try out this new drug that actually shrinks tumors in TSC. It was miraculous. So that's the first time she'd had, the year before we went on the clinical trial, she'd had 2 surgeries, 2 collapsed lungs, and several hospitalizations. Since going on the drug in 2008, she has not been in hospital even once, has not suffered any of those side effects, and her tumors have shrunk to almost being undetectable. As a Canadian in this day and age, that we cannot get access to a drug that saves lives and makes the quality of life so much better. If the PMPRB review goes through, which did little to talk to patients about, by the way, if those kinds of medications and life-saving treatments will not be available for anyone in Canada. It should be not depend on what province you live in or what country you live if you can save your life or your child's life. This is unacceptable.
Your child's life. This is.
Thank you very much. Fred, I believe you know Kathy, since Alberta was one of the first provinces actually to fund the drug that her daughter depends on. You've worn a lot of hats, but I'm going to ask you to talk from the perspective of health policy and health systems. How do you reconcile what Andrea and Craig have been talking about in terms of the proposed price controls? How do you reconcile that as a policymaker?
Yeah, well, I'll just say I do remember Kathy. Unfortunately, I had a bit of an audio issue on my end, so I didn't hear the whole video. But your question is, how do we reconcile? Well, the truth really is, Johan, we can't reconcile the experience of people like Kathy and many other families across the country, nor can, in my opinion, nor can we actually reconcile what the proposed changes, the way those have been developed by PMPRB, with any other sort of normal policy development process in healthcare in Canada. And I say that for a few reasons. One is, just to be clear, the function of regulation and regulators is to enable the implementation of policy and to monitor policy and enforce policy. But regulation is rooted in policy. And in this case, I think that's the biggest thing that's lacking. If we were to look at other important areas in the healthcare system, primary healthcare, mental health, most long-term strategies, begin with an agreement and an articulation of societal outcomes, not just with respect to, to funding the healthcare system, but long-term outcomes around access. They contain metrics for measuring the degree to which policy is delivering those outcomes. They consider unintended consequences, potential unintended consequences of a policy before it is implemented, and strategies to mitigate those unintended consequences as well. So these are just a few of the key elements of full-scale policy development in healthcare, or any other aspect of social policy. In this situation, one of the things that really disturbs me is we don't have that. We don't have, with the potential exception of, the Plan for National Pharmacare, which is we don't have a consensus on that. We don't. We have a report of a task force. We don't really have anything that articulates what we're hoping to achieve through these changes. When we look at a regulator trying to fill that gap, and my goal here isn't to sort of cast aspersions on anyone's motives or the work that's been done, but if we put the regulator in a position of trying to create policy on the fly, that regulator then has to make many assumptions, one of which in this case is that, cost containment is the most important outcome of our work in this regard. Just a couple of other points I wanted to make, and just go back to what Dr. Campbell said. People talk about rare disease and they talk about emerging therapies as something that's a new topic of discussion in the Canadian healthcare system. We have a policy framework. We have a very good draft policy framework in the form of the CORD Rare Disease Strategy for Canada, released in 2016. It includes many of the elements that I already talked about, and it would be an excellent foundation for PMPRB and for other players to look at, how to implement regulatory changes, which are only one part of the equation. The other thing we haven't talked a lot about yet is, when you put a regulator in this position, yes, you may get certain outcomes taking precedence, in this case, cost containment. When you introduce elements that are not traditionally part of regulation, such as the pharmacoeconomic data, we haven't even talked about the role of the GDP variable in determining how a drug is going to be treated under this proposed new regime. You also then put the regulator in the de facto position of gatekeeper, or a screening, prompts a screening process, and I think Andrea did a great job of describing how that actually may may unfold. So we take things that should be under control, and the choices associated with those elements, and we're actually, abdicating on a lot of those by simply moving forward with these regulatory changes. So it's a problem, and I can't think of any other area in our healthcare system that was as important as access to pharmaceuticals where we would do this. On the flip side, you look at an emergency situation, you look at something like COVID-19, and I think Canada's done a really good job collaboratively, right, between the federal government, the provinces, all the different stakeholder groups, of articulating outcomes, right, in our approach, of articulating guiding principles, which is something else that's missing here with PMPRB, and of working together and leveraging resources and skills and expertise, and I think doing quite a good job for Canadians, albeit the services and a lot of the components are delivered through the provinces. So we can do this. And we can do it the right way, and we don't have to start from, a blank piece of paper to figure this out. So those are some of the things that go through my mind when I think about this. And just on a personal level, as a health minister, how are decisions about access to drugs for rare disorders made now? They're made in the most, least optimum way possible. They're quite often punted to ministers. So they're punted to people at a political level when the predicted cost on a per patient basis exceeds a certain threshold. When I was minister in Alberta, that threshold was $100,000. And I can't think of a worse way to try to make a decision in the best interest of patients and the best interest of the health system than to default, to sort of a political, informed, but ultimately a political judgment. We can do a lot better than this, and we should be.
Well, I appreciate it so much, Fred, and it's certainly been a huge asset for us to be able to have you in terms of guidance and also some really, good experience and knowledge. I'm going to go back maybe to Andrea and ask you a follow-up question. So one of the suggestions, as we talked about in the PMPRB, is that we just implement the 11-country comparison. So that will bring us down to about the OECD median. What do you think of that proposal? What if we just did that part? How do you think companies would respond?
I think overall that's, we all have, as I said, we all have the same ultimate goal, which is access to medicines for Canadians and Canadian rare disease patients. And we're going to have to find common ground. We all have different goals that we want, but we need to find some sort of middle ground that works for manufacturers, for payers, for PMPRB and their pricing objectives. So I think in that case, there are some concerning factors across a number of the different components of the proposed guidelines. But I think that's one that would at least give us that predictability and certainty that I had spoken about earlier. I think that would sort of suffice from that perspective. It does give PMPRB some price reduction, so it would achieve one of their goals. And hopefully it shouldn't set us back as much as some of the other factors. I think for most of industry, the most concerning element is that, or especially for, the rare disease community, I think that the most concerning factor is the pharmacoeconomic piece of that proposal. In looking at that, if you go back, I guess there was some research done by Nigel Rawson that showed that of rare disease drugs that went through CADIS and so had their HTA or their pharmacoeconomic model, I guess it proposed about, I think it was discounts of 42 to 97% was the range. So if that becomes the starting point for where a drug is priced and then you start to negotiate discounts, that's a very, very concerning piece. And I think a big piece of that is that it's just not the appropriate framework for pricing. HTA models were not designed to determine a maximum price. So it's just sort of crossing two, Fred, you were talking about the guiding principles. It crosses two sort of elements that it doesn't make sense to cross. So it's not an appropriate measure for pricing. So to your question, I think, the PMPRB 11 is maybe something we could manage and work through and have further discussions on the other elements that are more concerning.
So pretty much, I think also agreeing then with Fred's perspective that, what is it that the regulator could and should be doing. I mean, we hear it a lot, in terms of, staying in your own lane in this case. Craig, I'm going to ask you something else. And I know you've been involved in a good number of research networks, et cetera. What do you think, listening to what Andrew is saying, what do you think Canada could do to actually make itself more attractive to, not just companies, but to others who want to do clinical trials, who want to do research in rare diseases? What can we do to make ourselves a more attractive site?
Yeah, well, I think there are some really key elements that we can do, and in fact, there are many pockets of of us leading this and doing various components. It's got to be incredibly frustrating. That's an understatement for a statement like the patient in the last video gave about just looking south of the border and knowing, in some cases less than 10 or 15 kilometers from where you live, there's someone getting a drug. And so I think, as Canadians, we have to recognize some of the realities of where we are, a small market and large geography, but we have a lot of things we can capitalize on too. A high standard of care across the country, very uniform care, and a strong attitude and experience of working together as a clinical community closely with our patients, and that leads quickly to then looking at cooperative research networks that can actually do two things. One, early in the phase of clinical trial planning is mitigate risk for pharma companies planning to come to Canada. And so we need really good, strong research networks with data sharing around, data that will help enable clinical trial planning in Canada. And there are many of those. One of the difficulties is there are not so much linked right now to the regulators. And then the other pivot we have to make as we do see rare disease drugs making their way through the process is being able to provide real world evidence through these research networks right very early on in the approval process and the immediate post-approval process. And I think that's something that both pharma, the disease community, and regulators should say, if we have a well-run, academic-based, real-world evidence source that we can get data from. To me, I don't understand why that wouldn't, one, be an important mitigating factor to smooth over some of the other barriers, but also be an important source of real-time evaluation of how that drug is performing while we cover it for a person. Well, while they're getting the drug and while we're sorting this out, we collect real-world evidence and feed that back into regulators. And that part, I'm not sure why we don't get the traction on that right now, even when those networks exist. So those are a couple of thoughts about, where as a clinical community we really need to continue to step up and generate this data that people can make important. These are important decisions. And the last little thing is I do think a lot of our clinical networks need to cultivate a relationship with pharma. We do tend to be a very conservative Canadians, a conservative group in terms of interaction with pharma. And these are healthy relationships I'm talking about, ones where there's clear disclosure of what you're doing. There's you lend your real expertise to pharma all the way along the pathway. There's ways to do that with integrity and to really make sure you're holding pharma to account based on your clinical experience. And I think that maturity has to come a little bit more in our rare disease clinicians across the country.
Well, if anybody's the epitome of making that happen, Craig, it's you. We have looked with admiration what you've done. I know very recently with our SMA community and how you have actually lived through all of that. So, and it's made a big difference in terms of being to advance not only the current access, but as you say, the future research opportunities. So I know that you live what it is that you're saying, and also the call for much better public-private partnerships. Bill, do I have time to bring Fred in one more question, or do you want to go to open questions?
It's up to you. If you want to throw something to Fred, we do have some good questions on the line though, so it's really wherever you want to go.
Well, do you have an open question for Fred, or do you want me to ask Fred one question here?
Well, why don't you start with that?
Okay, let me ask Fred.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things we really want to know, based on what you already said, Fred, was we are all feeling really frustrated by the lack of transparent consultation, especially around the PMPRB. So is there any way we can break through that impasse? You've been on the inside, you know, is there a way that we can actually have those kinds of transparent discussions?
Well, I think to do it, I'm not sure that the audience is the PMPRB. I think the audience are the leaders in the country. They're the ministers, they're the deputy ministers. They're the people that are actually going to be accountable in the end for the impact of these changes, you know, for better or for worse, as the case unfolds. They're the people that can build the infrastructure, you know, the things that Dr. Campbell was talking about, registries, access to real world evidence, the ability to harmonize regulation as it pertains to drugs for rare disease, with other, you know, with other jurisdictions like Europe and the United States. Those are all part of considerations that should be rooted in policy. And I think the message is, you know, to leaders like the people I've been talking about is, you know, well and good. We understand that you want to help us with reducing the overall cost of pharmaceuticals in Canada, but we need to do this right. It needs to be grounded in a vision for the future. And if you think about the environment of rare disease drugs, I mean, this is really an excellent proxy for the kinds of decisions that we'll have to deal with in personalized medicine, which has already arrived and which is, you know, manifesting in big ways in areas such as oncology. I think I'll just quickly to finish. So why might not people in positions like I held be as tuned into this? Quite frankly, it's not our tradition in Canada to make decisions in healthcare that involved managing uncertainty over time, granting access and then stopping access to drugs, if we're talking about drugs, as those things change over time. We're very much a program-based culture. Most of our statutes and regulations are designed to keep people out as much as to let people in. And we budget based on individual program lines. So our whole philosophy has to change, and it has to begin with those leaders having that dialogue.
Well, I'm really, really excited about the opportunities. We're hoping to do some more webinars, but really we'd like to do some roundtables. So we're hoping that maybe we can invite all of you back to actually have that kind of discussion. How do we move forward on this, right? Because that's what we need to do. Taking what, you know, Dr. Campbell's recommending in terms of managed access, using that real world data, et cetera. So, you know, definitely what you're talking to is towards solutions. I'm happy to say that I've been invited as one of 5 patient organizations to actually submit or present in front of the House Standing Committee on Health this evening. Actually, they've convening a meeting, most of it around, you know, what are the challenges that COVID has presented to the more chronic diseases, but it will be an opportunity for us to present exactly, I think, what some of this conversation has been about. So this has been really informative for me in terms of going into that discussion. Bill, I'm going to toss it to you. You have a couple of burning questions.
Yeah, well, one comment, I think there's a lot of appreciation coming to Andrea for explaining what it's like to sit in your shoes and make these decisions and make the case for Canada. There was a couple of comments that noted that they were very unclear about how and why of the pricing issue, and just a lot of appreciation for that. The follow-on from that, and this might go back to Durhan, you know, how can patients and other stakeholders engage with the federal government on this specific issue? So I don't know if you want to mentioned the e-petition that right now is at the House of Commons, the Fight for Our Lives campaign. And then there was another suggestion that came through about could we exempt rare diseases and treatments for rare diseases completely from the remit of PMPRB. So, and please keep the questions coming, but I'll throw those two issues, what to do about it, and an idea to you, Durhan.
Well, we do know that patient advocacy is hugely important in terms of moving these issues, and I'm sure Fred and and others in his position have appreciated that. We do have a number of campaigns that are in place. There's an e-petition that has been started by a member of the cystic fibrosis community. It's on our website to really, kind of add your name to saying we need to stop what the PMPRB is doing until we've got proper consultations, or even just to pull out those regulations. We need a rethink in terms of what those regulations are. The second thing is we also have a campaign, to Fight for Our Lives campaign. Those videos that you've seen are part of it. We're also asking, write to your representative, let them know, what it is and how this is impacting you. And I think Fred was great in terms of saying we've got to get to those policy leaders. And we do think the personal cases and the personal stories are hugely important in terms of being able to get us there. And certainly, we are always looking for, I think, those collaborative opportunities, right, in terms of being able to move forward here. And you had a second question, Bill. I've forgotten what it was.
It was more about some policy solutions. Could we potentially exempt
exempting
PMPRB
rare diseases
from rare? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably going to not make any friends with my rare disease community by saying no. And I think others have already alluded to it. There's nothing magical about a rare disease. Rare diseases are in the position they are because we're small in numbers, difficult to get the diagnosis, difficult to get access, really needing, a lot of specialty. But quite frankly, number one, these regulations affect any novel therapies that are going to be coming in. They're going to be in cancer, they're going to be in other areas. Gene therapies across the board are going to be hugely impacted. Talking personalized medicines, again, those are going to be breakthroughs for so many diseases where, we can actually get in and be able to stop the disease, to be able to find fixes. So I don't want us to carve out a space just for rare diseases. I want us to be able to fix the system so everybody can actually get the best access. So no, there's nothing magical about rare diseases in that respect.
And this is, I promised earlier in the webinar to bring this forward because there were several questions from last week regarding COVID and therapeutics and vaccines. I don't know, Andrea, if you want to comment on how or whether the PMPRB would apply to some of these new therapeutics that are people are excited about. One just got fast tracked through the FDA for emergency use. Any thoughts on a vaccine or therapeutic for and what PMPRB might do in those cases?
Yeah, I mean, I as far as I'm aware, I have no idea if they're looking at any right now, but I would think that all patented medicines have to go through the same process and regulation as others, whether you're being fast-tracked through or not. I mean, as it stands right now, PMPRB already does regulate the prices of drugs that are coming in through SAP. So whether there's a Health Canada approval or not, those drug prices are regulated. So I would imagine that PMPRB would still have the same sort of regulatory authority over any new medicines or new uses that are being considered.
Can you imagine
I don't have any specifics.
But can you imagine the outrage there would be if we actually had a therapy, a treatment for COVID, and the PMPRB were to actually, number one, intervene to actually have to do that kind of pricing. Number two, to come up with a cost per quality that would basically say, sorry, we're going to have to get you to knock that price way down for Canada. Because I don't see, unless they're coming in at a giveaway price, unless they're coming in at a Slovenia price for us, that we're going to be able to exempt that. But we know that nobody's going to let that happen. And I think that's the concern that, we have in terms of how that is not being applied to many of our rare disease drugs, which are equally life-saving. I think that's the challenge we've got.
Excellent. And one additional comment to supplement what you were saying, Andrea, about the time horizon for the business case. One of our attendees noted that Canada's patent life and the actual time of market exclusivity here is shorter than what you can get in Europe or the United States. So the business case is already hard in terms of the time before a generic can come to market and compete. And so that, given that plus what's happening with PMPRB, that's just another factor that has to be brought into that. I don't know if that happens in your case, building that business case.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at the drug over a horizon. So often you're looking they'll look at 5 years. It depends. Each company will have different long range plan timelines. So, but you will be looking over time. So that is something that, to be honest, I can't think of specific examples where I've had to include that specifically in my, but you are looking at the time that you have a patent and when you expect, and if you expect generics or SEB or biosimilars to come in.
Yeah.
So
and Durhan, you will have seen examples where the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is maybe waiting for another therapeutic option to come forward before they actually make a decision. So even if the company's not looking for those opportunities to negotiate lower prices or regulate lower prices, certainly the payers are, right?
I think this has been a challenge, is that sometimes you see, just because of where research is, right, 2 or 3 drugs are coming in on the heels, and sometimes they will just hold off, bringing in any drug until all of them have gone through the process, which means that patients are not getting access until they've actually had it. But we've also seen some things that are quite interesting, and Craig, you will know this well, is that based on how, cost effectiveness assessments are done, if there's no therapy that's ever been in place, like with SMA, then the challenge is, what do we compare it to? Well, we're comparing it to, standard of care, which was kind of like nothing. So it's hard to come up with, what's the reasonable, added value. But once you've gotten one drug in, then the next drug actually has an easier pathway, because now you've set a benchmark for what you're willing to pay for that therapy. And I think this is going to be interesting as we see, the second and the third and maybe the fourth therapies coming in for something like SMA, because we've, you guys have fought the battle for the first drug, and now maybe it'll be easier to get the second and third in, as opposed to something like FOP, which actually has nothing again, and they may have to start at 0. I don't know. What do you think, Craig?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I think not only does, one of the struggles in the rare disease space, particularly for the clinicians, and is that things are so rare that you're often only doing this journey once in your whole career. And so to have something like an SMA scenario where you've had such progress so quickly, we have learned a lot of lessons, and I think can be more impactful the second time and the third time around. And of course, it'll put various ability to compare drugs. And again, I would speak.
I think we've kind of frozen him.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, well, that sounded eloquent. We will pick up from where it is and we'll make him write it back into us. It's probably good for us anyway. We need to kind of close up, maybe just with a summary, Bill. So we just want to kind of close off. We had a couple of recommendations from last week that we wanted to pass on, certainly for the PMPRB. One is to, make sure that we're thinking about policies and pricing policies. Things start with the patients, and you heard the patient stories. You heard, Dr. Campbell. We really, I think, as Andrew's really alluded to here, the PMP should not be a punitive body. They shouldn't be out there trying to kind of play, kind of policeman to the pharmaceutical industry. Really, we're all trying to work in terms of the public good. And I think that's what Fred was saying. At the end of the day, we've all got to be on the same side here. And I'm glad that Andrew said what she does, because one of our recommendations was going to be, if a 20% reduction is what you can get by bringing in the basket of 11, and you can get to the median of the OECD, that should be, kind of good enough to start with. Okay, let's go with that, and then we can figure out the rest. And as Fred has said, for the policymakers, which really is an important element here, we want them to get involved. We want them to take a role, not in terms of directly, dealing with individual drugs that they've got, but to recognize what their role is as policymakers. And I think that's something very important in terms of taking on the proper role learning, as you said, down the road. How many politicians have I talked to that said, I did not know that that's what the PMPRB, regulatory changes were going to impact? And I'd say, good gosh, you voted for it. You did not, but it's not their fault. Nobody worked out the consequences for them. But do be aware of what the unintended consequences are. And I think one of the things we are learning out of COVID is how much we need, the public-private partnership. So that's been, huge. Just the last slide there, Bill, in terms of where we're going. So we had a webinar last week. You can find that on our website. You can find the links on it. We've got this webinar, which will be available in 24 hours, and Bill's team is brilliant in terms of trying to bring that in within that 24 hours. So we'll have the YouTube and we'll have the slide deck. Next week, we've got a very exciting webinar for you, which will be bringing in an international speaker from the Office of Health Economics, who's actually had with their a whole group has looked at the proposed PMPRB guidelines and have some really critical comments in terms of what they're proposing. And we're going to have the opportunity to have a presenter talk about Sandra Anderson from Innomar, who's going to talk about what she has learned when she's gone to try to pitch Canada to other countries. What are they asking? Sort of like Andrea's perspective, but from other companies outside of Canada. What are they asking before they will decide whether they want to bring a drug to Canada? And we will have PG Faray, who is one of the leading policy thinkers in our country, who's going to give us some broader perspectives as well. And are there some ways that we can do this in a much more intelligent way? Very much what Fred was talking about. So I'll close it out from there. Really thank everybody for their participation. This has been such an educational forum for me as well. I'm really so excited in terms of I think in the midst of the despair around where we feel like people aren't listening, we do hope that people are listening to this and that we will be able to really open up intelligent conversations and really invite everybody to join us next week when we will have another program. And really, I will say that look forward to it. We're hoping to have some different kinds of roundtables, et cetera, going forth in terms of this summer. So thank you again very much. And huge thanks to Bill Dempster with 360 for all of the work in terms of making this series happen with us. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.